Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Today we're going to talk about the negative father complex and how we can heal from it. We've done a previous episode on healing from a negative mother complex, and several listeners wrote into us asking for us to address this topic, and we agreed it was an important concept that deserved its own episode. Much more is written in psychoanalytic literature about the influence of the mother on the child's psyche. Less has been written about the father, but we think it's just as important, and we want to walk around that issue today.
And to make things even more complicated right at the outset, we all have internal parents inside us. So the mother has a negative or positive father complex as well as a positive or negative mother complex. So we get that from our same-sex parent as well as from the opposite-sex parent. So it doesn't have to be your biological father. It's others, other caretakers contribute to a father complex as well.
So the feeling that we have with all of the parental complexes is that they have a pervasive quality, they have an atmospheric quality. A lot of times, because the parental complexes are woven into the bedrock of our psyches, that we will all take them for fundamental assumptions about ourselves and the world. And yet, because they're so powerful, they really deserve some concentrated attention.
Yeah. Yes, I think that the parental complexes, father and mother, are so woven into the bedrock, as you said, where we start out in life. We are wired for relationship. We wouldn't survive without relationship. We notice immediately and at stages of infancy what masculine voices are like, what masculine touch is like. And even if it isn't there in the home, if somebody was magically raised in an environment of all females, still because the father archetype is embedded in each female, it's still there.
Yeah, I think there's this way that we're dealing with an archetype, and that archetype might have something to do with logos and ordering and sort of directed action, those kinds of things. And also, we are dealing with this personal relationship. And Joseph, I appreciated your use of the word atmospheric. That really kind of sent me into reverie a little bit. Because I think when we're growing up in a home with a father who is emotionally absent or perhaps critical or unhappy or himself very wounded, we drink that up. It's like the water we swim in if we're a fish. It's just there, and it influences us. I always like to say that we need to be loved as children, but we also need to be enjoyed. And I'll sometimes ask people that I'm working with, I'll say, did you feel enjoyed as a child? And sometimes that's a quite shocking question. You know, Winnicott said something similar, but I think that making our parents beam with pride, or because we're funny, seeing their faces light up when we walk in the room, that builds up an expectation, if we have that experience, that the world will meet us. And if our father glowers at us from beneath his brows when we walk in the room, that creates a different kind of expectation of the world.
And I think a more subtle impact is that many of us were raised in homes where the father, as part of the social milieu, wasn't around. For me, being raised in the 60s and 70s, we were raised in Long Island. My father got up before I was awake for school. He took the train into Manhattan. He came back after I was asleep. He was just kind of invisible. And so I really just got to see him, on Saturdays and Sundays. And I think, whole generations of baby boomers were raised that way, where it wasn't so much that my father was glowering at me, is that, I was kind of raised by my mother's fantasies of a man, or her own father complex was kind of advising her or trying to constellate what was missing, which I think is, it was, of course, what Robert Bly writes about so much in Iron John.
Yeah, that's a wonderful book and a wonderful fairy tale about the development of a man's psyche as relates to the father and the mother complex. I think culturally, what you're raising is really relevant, Joseph. And I'm also aware that in addition to fathers working outside the home for long hours, there also was a cultural expectation in the 50s, 60s, 70s that dads were just not going to be that involved.
Oh, even before that, I think even in antiquity, in Renaissance, medieval times, you didn't become interesting to the world of men until you could participate somehow in their world. So you became interesting as a child when you could pump the bellows for your dad who was about blacksmith. But before that, you were a baby. And boys, for instance, were often dressed in dresses several years. They were kind of their mom's baby dolls, for instance. Now I think that, well, in my generation, I think things have changed now. That as children, we didn't become more interesting, or I didn't feel I was, until I was probably 10, 11, or 12. But I've actually become really active in the world.
Yeah, I think that in some cultures, there's been more room for fathers to be involved with younger kids. And like you said, I think things are changing now, where it's very acceptable for fathers to be more nurturing. And then there's that wonderful role that fathers play with young children of being the roughhouser and the tickler and the teaser and the scutcher, as we called it in our household, and just how very important that is, that particular role.
That the father is robust enough to be the one you wrestle with and you can punch when you're 4 years old.
Well, I think we're sort of circling around cultural gender norms that you, Joseph, are talking about, of what you absorbed. And I did too. The fathers went off first thing in the morning and they came home pretty late at night. And they weren't participants really in the dailiness of interacting with children. And then what do daughters learn? And what tends to be a daughter's father complex, because she's been instilled with certain kinds of values about what a young lady ought to be, what a girl ought to be, what you grow up to be. And the same thing for sons, that the son can go off and help his blacksmith father and pump the bellows, but that's not what a girl does. And I think that huge, of course, influences our internal world around the complex that we have for our fathers.
And now that I think we've kind of evoked father into the space, our topic today, which by necessity is fairly narrow because it is broadly so enormous, is the negative complex. So kind of limiting it, because this is probably more of what we see in our practice, is that if people have generally very positive complexes, things are fairly pleasant for them in the world. It could be limiting their creativity in some ways, but it's generally not causing them an awful lot of pain. So what shows up in the clinical setting are often painful complexes. And for me, I'll just toss out one topic we can riff on is, again, I work with a lot of military. Dads go to war, and then they come back and they're changed. And the idea of the traumatized father. And what is it like, or what is the effect of a dad who's, trapped in horrible, nightmarish images, a dad who feels that he can't relate to his children or his wife after he comes back from war, or so much of his libido is caught up in healing himself because he was so hurt psychospiritually, even if the body comes back robust. And, I hear that story well enough, and it can show up in a couple of different ways. One is that the family creates a kind of valorized story about the dad, that he's no longer a dad, he's a hero. And heroes are very hard to approach.
Hard to have a relationship with a hero.
Hard to live up to. I mean, is that my destiny? Is that I have to be a war hero? And a number of the men in my practice are multi-generational military men. So the story of this is the path to manhood and hoping to be transformed into a hero by living out the father's story. In one sense, we all have an impulse to applaud that story. But, I have guys in my practice that, are poets and they're in the military. And the poetry didn't have any room to breathe because the archetype of the heroic father just took up all the air.
Yeah, I have also worked with combat veterans, and I know what you're talking about, Joseph. I mean, one of the things that I'm recollecting is that some of these men felt so damaged and kind of, I want to say, unclean. They just felt themselves to be beyond the pale and felt that they almost couldn't allow themselves to get too close to their kids for fear that they would damage them. It's very poignant.
So then the father, in his own mind, has become poisonous.
I mean, these were Vietnam vets, and that, of course, has a particular cultural flavor around it because of the way that Vietnam vets were treated when they got home. So they really carried a cultural shadow and then almost felt like they had to hold themselves apart from their children in some cases.
So I'm thinking about, so far we have two sort of images here in our discussion of the heroic father that is hard to relate to because there's a sort of archetypal aura around it. The traumatized father who is encapsulated in his own world of unmediated feelings. I'm thinking about absent fathers, whether that's a literal truth that there was a father that just somehow left or was divorced or even died. And I'm also thinking about the emotionally absent father, the father that never really, one way or another, was present enough for his children to constellate an image of father. And then there are abusive fathers, whether that abuse is a father who's overly critical or rejecting, somebody who's present but sends a lot of emotional negativity toward one or all of his children. And that each of these can, constellate or give a flavor to the negative father complex.
Well, if we're going to pick up, Deb, on this idea of the absent father, I'm thinking of a kind of absence that Jung experienced around his father. His father was a pastor, but he didn't have any faith. And so Jung, as a adolescent, got very interested in religion and wanted to have these conversations with his father, who was the person who should know about these things. And he could not engage his father around this and recognize that there was a real hollowness in his father's life, which frustrated the young Carl Jung, and also, I think, left him wanting to redeem that in his father. In some sense, you could say that was the nature of his life's work.
It's really moving that might have been exactly what happened in Jung, and that we often take it on as a mission to redeem the lost or absent parent. And then Jung went on to have an incredible relationship with Sigmund Freud, and writes to him that he wants to be the son to Freud, and not to just interact as equals, but that Jung wants to learn from Freud, wants Freud to mentor him, and wants a father figure so that he can internalize that healthy, assertive, protective father energy in himself.
And what I believe Jung's father's name was Paul. Is that right? Did I have that
Yes.
right? Okay. What Paul was lacking was a kind of philosophical or spiritual backbone.
And I think that again, we're all hypothesizing
Of
a lot
course.
of verve. Um, one of Jung's early dreams also was that he was in an underground chamber and he found on a dais this enormous phallic image, which is kind of monstrous, full of awe, and kind of godlike. And so, what goes underground is the phallic force.
Mm-hmm.
And by all accounts, Freud
Freud had a lot of that.
a lot of phallos, a
Right.
lot of
He had a lot of, he knew, he had, if Paul was lacking in faith, Sigmund had a lot of faith.
Yes.
big throbbing faith.
Yes.
Oh, thanks for that image, Joseph.
What?
The missing libido from Jung's father, he found in Freud, who was going to have things be his way,
Mm-hmm.
period, end of subject. He was not open to Jung's own discoveries, in particular of the collective unconscious and all of Jung's interest in symbolism and mythology and so on. So in a way, we might say, I wonder if Jung lived out one form of a negative father complex only to discover another that also was powerfully negative and left Jung in a state of real dissolution, depression, disorientation for 5 or 6 years.
Well, I think it's such a poignant story because when we're lacking something in one parent and we go out into the world and project that onto someone and we enter into this intense relationship with them, it's almost always really pretty wounding, isn't it?
So we have landed on something that is, very common, which is that we will project what we need onto another human being, onto another father figure. And it happens often in romantic relationships of, the person that wants a protective, strong, authoritative father may find that in a romantic partner or a boss or, a pastor.
A mentor.
Or it goes on and on. Can we step back from that and say, wow, what's going on here for me? What am I doing internally that I'm experiencing externally in the world?
And also, it's not necessarily pathologic that the father complex gets projected, or in Jung's situation, because the psyche projects, as we've said before, in order to be known. So Jung may have never known that he had a father complex until the drama unfolded with Freud. And another way, just returning back to that, is, Freud seemed to be particularly phallic, and he had this model, the sexual libido model in one way, and he wanted to beget that upon the earth.
Yeah.
He wanted to disseminate the psychological community with his idea, and in his letters to Jung, it was a lot about don't abandon my theories, give birth to these ideas. And not only did Jung move away from that, but actually he wrote a pretty powerfully hostile publications against Freud. So it wasn't just that he kind of floated to stage left, but he really stood against Freud, tried to take him on or take him down, which is an interesting dynamic, going back to wrestling with the father earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
It's that, Freud was kind of, really didn't want to have anything else sprout around him. And Jung, in a sense, built some muscle, we would imagine, eventually by, kind of going after daddy Freud. And I think that dynamic does happen. There's a lot of men that are really angry at their dads as a way of becoming their own person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And just to throw this out, it's an interesting idea that von Franz brings up in some of her writing, that we can individuate in one of two ways primarily. One is through hatred, because when we are in a state of deep hatred, we are creating strong delineations between ourselves and the hated object. And that can constellate a sense of solidity in a person, or we can individuate by recognizing an emerging image of ourselves that is uniquely rising up from within us, and we lend resources to this actualization. And either of those ways is a path to becoming a singular person. A lot of men play out this wrestling, angry, slapping around between their fathers to become their own person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So this struggle with a negative father complex can absolutely be part of an individuation process.
That it creates a kind of rebellion against the authority and power that the father carries, in some sense of how do you push back against that. And it tends to be a kind of often a very forceful sort of separation. I think I'm also just sort of walking around the word hate, that I want to put anger in there. I want to put rebellion in there. I want to just put healthy pushback in there. And that tends to sort of be more present in the father complex often than in the mother complex as a feeling state, a quality of the feeling. It's not that separating from the mother is necessarily easy, but it carries a different feeling tone, I think.
So if a man has this kind of father complex, just bringing it back into the clinical room, so a man has very strong memories of kind of boxing with his dad in order to become his own person. If the complex gets kind of locked in those set of images and doesn't continue to evolve, a man can go through his life thinking that boxing with authority figures is the paradigm. That, part of being in the corporate world is looking at the authority figures and figuring out how he can make them wrong, how he can take them down a peg, how he can supplant them, kind of kill the king and usurp the throne. And it can actually interfere with the emergence of a much more collaborative paradigm.
Well, if you're in that space vis-a-vis authority figures, then you're really acting in a somewhat infantile way. And we might even imagine that person was moving through the world as a Pwhere.
So a negative father complex can constellate a lot of pictures like this, the picture of the Pwhere or the picture of the rebel, the picture of somebody who's very sad and powerless and maybe somewhat depressed. And that we would be curious about that person's relationship to father as the carrier of the father archetype.
Yeah, and I want to say on that I think that some wrestling with the father is healthy. And although if we're working with a young man, say in his 20s, and he's railing against his father, we're not necessarily going to say that he has a negative father complex, because it might be part of a developmental stage to sort of project something on the father that then needs to be worked through. But let's pick up on what happens if the dad is really abusive or critical. What does that look like? And in particular, what does that look like in a man's psyche versus a woman's psyche?
I really like Fairbairn's model around this. Fairbairn was a psychoanalyst and kind of took a leap in his own direction away from Freud. He was a Scottish fellow, and he was very interested in the effects of having a monstrous parental figure, which could be a father or a mother. But what he imagined is when we're really young and we have, let's say, a monstrous father in one dimension or another, that the child is caught in this tremendous tension, this kind of split, because on the most kind of instinctive level, the child needs to be able to bond and to be pleasing even to a very traumatizing parent. And yet they're also really angry and feel hateful towards how they're being treated. So what often Fairbairn theorized is that the child would create two different split images of the father, that one was the monstrous father that would show up in the inner world, and one was the overly idealized father which would show up in the inner world. And depending on which version of the parent that the child was negotiating with, they would be tremendously pleasing towards the version of the father that was pleasant from time to time, and then particularly cunning and ferocious and undermining towards the monstrous father. And by the way, this is really unpacked in a chilling way in that movie, The Babadook, although that's the maternal split between the monstrous mother and the loving mother, and how the child has to split in order to know who he's dealing with. So in that kind of a split, Fairbairn said it can lead to a kind of obsessional quality in the child, that the child is often obsessively trying to be pleasing towards the pleasing potential in authority figures, and split off their own hostility, which then is kind of lurking around in some other realm.
Yeah, and that's that relentless hope. Because you haven't integrated those two aspects, you're still always hoping to be able to find the thing that you're never going to find from that parent. There's an Algonquin fairy tale that I really like, that I think is just in this neighborhood of the monstrous father complex. And it starts with a woman and I believe her husband, and they're alone in the forest. And they've gone out for the day, and they come back, and right outside their tent is this monstrous Chenoo, which is sort of like this ice giant. And he's covered with sticks and fur, and he's going to eat them. And so she cunningly says, "Father, it's so good to see you. Where have you been?" And he's a little bit dazed, so he sort of goes along with it. And she brings him in, and she feeds him something, and she makes a bed for him. But then there they are. They've got this Chenoo living with them, and neither one of them can go to sleep for fear that he'll suddenly turn on them. And then the rest of the fairy tale goes, it's just beautiful. Talks about how this gets redeemed, and how finally the giant Chenoo gives them the tool that they need to bring him back down to size. And I thought it was a beautiful story of a resolution, if you will, of a negative father complex.
So that's a really, we have a list here now that I'm sort of tracking of how people deal with a negative father complex. So in this story, the befriending of the giant, aligning oneself and establishing a positive relationship. People can rebel or just push back and separate. Joseph, you're talking about Fairbairn and splitting and having an internal positive and an internal negative parental image. We've talked about projecting. And I think also in the mix is the person with a negative father complex who just becomes lackluster, depressed, somewhat powerless, and doesn't access the libido necessary to transform the negative father complex.
I want to, if I may, bring up a little case example, if I can take the liberty to do this, and talk a little bit about Charlotte Bronte. This is something that I've written on. So we might imagine, or history tells us, that Patrick Bronte was a pretty negative father. Some biographers differ on that, but there seems to be a consensus that he wasn't a super nice guy. A couple of little examples. He really doted on his son Branwell, who wound up, I believe, dying of heroin and alcohol addiction. But he would tell the girls to leave off writing and go darn their brother's socks. He really supported Branwell's creative endeavors and didn't set much store by his daughters, who comprise, several of the greatest novelists in the English language. The other detail in the story here is he sent his daughters to the Cowan Bridge School, which, if you're a fan of Jane Eyre, was apparently worse than Lowood School. Charlotte said that she left out some of the worst atrocities she experienced at Cowan Bridge because she didn't think that readers would find it believable. But 2 of her sisters were sent home from Cowan Bridge on death's door and then did die. And it was after the second sister died that Patrick brought the other girls back. So Emily and Charlotte were both there. I can't remember right now if Anne was also at the school, but he either brought the 2 or 3 of them back home, and that probably saved their lives. Charlotte grows up with a negative father complex. When she's a young woman, she and Emily go to Belgium to teach at a school there. And Charlotte falls in love with the professor who runs the school. Now, he's married, but he immediately must have seen what he had in her. He saw her intelligence and befriended her. And she was so hungry, so starved to be seen like that, that she fell deeply in love with him, and she wrote him these letters. But of course, it was unrequited, and he eventually stopped writing letters back to her after I think his wife got upset about it. And there she is. She's back on the moors in Yorkshire, and she writes Jane Eyre, which, as I understand it, the way I understand that novel is it's an extended, active imagination about the negative father complex as personified by Rochester in the story. And I think that one of the things this tells us is that there's a certain kind of negative father complex that in the psyche of a woman can create a sense of longing, of unrequited longing for love, and give rise to a kind of ghostly lover phenomenon, where she's always seeking something that she never quite finds.
That is such a moving story of a negative father who repeatedly dismissed his daughters who colluded in this terrible, depriving school. And everybody knew that it was a terrible school. And it almost feels like a fairy tale. I'm so, the happy ending, so to speak, is that Charlotte writes Jane Eyre. She comes into possession of her own creative libido as a way of healing the father complex. And I think that there are quite a number of fairy tales that carry some of this same theme. There's quite a list of tales from Cinderella and Snow White to Rapunzel and Hansel and Gretel and Beauty and the Beast. And there's a really long list that seems to carry this theme of, for a girl, of come into your own self, come into your own power, access your own energy. There's a note of encouragement there.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I realized when I started working with Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre is that Jane Eyre is really a Beauty and the Beast story.
She transforms Rochester in the course of the story.
Yes. And she's kind of sacrificed by her father to the beast, whom she later learns to love and then transforms.
I'm thinking about, for sort of purposes of parallel construction, as it were, what are the stories about men and their negative father complex? And I'm thinking about all the stories of the dumbling in the fairy tale, the son that is not as accomplished, is seen as kind of a doofus. Even thinking about Jack and the Beanstalk, and that these are our sons. Often the dumbling is being sent out finally as a last resort by his father, the king, to find the water of life or the secret treasure.
Or the most beautiful bride, or whatever the case may be.
And we have all those heroic stories, the Grail stories of Parsifal and so on, of coming into their own authority and kind of masculine power.
I think that we're talking about this very positive arc of development, but I want to come back to this scenario again. Let's say in the psyche of a woman who's had a negative father complex, or perhaps even a monstrous father. And so what we were talking about earlier was when the ego perennially identifies with the child pole of that dynamic. So if we imagine in the psyche, in order for you to have a father complex, somewhere in the psyche there has to be a child complex, because the Pwhere puella and the father are always on a polarity. So there are plenty of scenarios, like you said, where the negative father is, and the memories of the negative father are constantly besieging the ego, which experiences itself as young and collapsed and small and without agency, or worse, kind of skulking, through life. But what I've also seen in a woman's psyche is that because that's such a painful position, that she will frequently inhabit the negative father's position and then move through the world abusing people in the way that her father did.
Mm-hmm.
I've definitely seen women in my practice who are eviscerating and brutal and cruel and menacing towards their coworkers, towards other women in the workplace, and visiting versions of this same demeaning and crushing behavior when they are possessed by their negative fathers.
Yeah, Joseph, I think that's exactly right. And the other thing you sometimes see is women with a negative father complex treating themselves as their father treated them. So if crushing, eviscerating, very critical, very perfectionistic.
Mm-hmm. But I don't want us to scoot off. It feels like it's hard for us to land in this other part of it, is that anytime a man or a woman has been treated very badly or abusively, they have an inner perpetrator. And that's a fact.
Yeah,
and
we all do.
We can't move off of that cavalierly.
No, I don't think I was meaning to. I mean, I think that
Mm-hmm.
that the inner perpetrator definitely affects those out in the environment, and it also affects us. We can become our own perpetrator.
Sure. And in the analytic environment, if we dig deeply enough in the transference, sooner or later, the child is going to be projected onto the analyst, and the abusing parent is going to come full barrel at the analyst, and it's going to be enacted in the room. We've all seen it. I've certainly seen it. It's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate, because the conscious attitude of the woman is that I'm a victim, I'm a baby. And so when they're rearing up in this kind of destructive rage, it's as if they almost can't even remember that they've done it or that they are capable of doing that. And yet that is the place of healing. Because as you said, a woman does need to know that she can be powerful, even destructively powerful. She has to be able to admit that, to then bridle it to higher goals, better ends.
Do you see a difference between this kind of negative father complex as it manifests in women from how it manifests in men?
I do. And I think about this on both sides, is that, let's say we have a boy and a girl raised in a home with a tyrannical father. The boy can actually co-opt a certain amount of that, the power of the tyrannical father, more easily, because there's a way in which he can merge with that. The girl will always feel in some way alien to the father. And so as the father inhabits her, the split in her own psyche is deeper. It's less permitted to be conscious, while the boy often could show up at school as a very motivated bully.
Yeah,
and
the kind of
justify the behavior.
Identification with the aggressor. Yeah.
And you'll also see that on the other side, that if we have an abusive mother, a girl can be in some ways less damaged by that, because she can absorb and identify with some of the power of that, while the boy will often feel simply beleaguered, and the destructive feminine stays much more in the unconscious.
I want to pick up on this a little bit, Joseph, because I think I raised this when we did our Negative Mother podcast, and I want to lift up something similar here. That I think another thing that can happen when we have a very wounding parent is we tell ourselves, I will never be like her, or I will never be like him. You know, he was awful and he is not allowed. And we may banish him from our psyche. We may banish him from our lives. But then that makes it very difficult, as I think you were saying, to come into a creative relationship to whatever qualities the father held. And so it just kind of lives in the unconscious in this way that feels fairly out of control. So there is this paradoxical way that we almost have to accept and befriend this monstrous negative father complex in order to integrate and transform it, which is very much what that Algonquin fairy tale shows. When she initially says, "Father, come in," I mean, she's terrified. And he's very dangerous. I mean, it's a very dangerous content to have living in your psychic tent. But over time, something happened, and we learn later in the fairy tale that the Chenoo is the keeper of the secret of the spring that is giving of life and meat even in the midst of winter. So it's the power that's hidden in the negative complex as well.
And that power is the archetype.
Exactly.
If the father archetype is surrounded by deeply painful memories, the center of it is a kind of divine father that holds all qualities, including positive potentials that may not have been experienced very frequently in the biological life. But when it can be discovered in this more spiritual plane and become activated, it can actually transform the complex and enable the father to be more life-giving and more useful in the psyche.
Yeah, that is really important and really well said. That what the healing part is from a Jungian perspective is being able to access the other polarity, that there is underneath or beside the negative father complex that you may have lived in your own home, whether that father was absent or critical or even abusive. Archetypally, there is positive father energy that belongs to this construct. And the point is to discover that in you, to discover a wellspring of positive authority, power in the world, creativity that is also yours. And we see that happening in the consulting room over time with people. It's, I think, what fuels us for this work is that it is possible and it can be lived.
And I think the gate into that, to that positive potential, which is further down the road, is being able to tolerate that we have or are capable of acting out in exactly the same ways that we have been acted upon. That's the first kind of...
we really have to make friends with the complex.
I'm actually going away from... I feel like we're being overly positive too quickly in the conversation. For me, I think that often in the beginning of the process, people will spend a year or two talking about how terrible dad is. And then as those qualities get categorized, dad was this, 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 and this. The next step, which is shadow work, is to be able to tolerate this tremendous, intense self-investigation, which is, what are the environments where you are exactly like that? And to sit in the darkness, to sit with the beast that you sometimes are. And if that stage is moved through too quickly, the positive potential can often just be a fantasy. But we have to burn in this darkness in order to liberate this other potential, rather than just acting it out in our lives and claiming that we're not doing it.
Yeah, and maybe just to sort of put a bow on this. And Deb, you were talking about the positive potential telos, and we've been talking about ways to transform it. When you do the kind of work, I think, Joseph, that you were just describing, things can really shift. And I'll just sort of maybe offer Charlotte's story as I understand it. Her novels, in my estimation, gave her a way to work with this negative complex and allowed her to really shift something. And she was, unlike any of her siblings, able to get married. None of the other siblings ever did. To get married, she had to stand toe to toe with her father, who did not approve of her marriage, but she did. She did it. She really had to fight for it. And she also was more creatively productive than any of her siblings. She wrote more novels than any of the other Brontes.
And that's the wonderful use of creativity, to be able to objectify the complex by making it into a character. Just like we do in active imagination, and which dreams do all the time. That we have a dream and versions of the father complex are moving around. That's our self-created novel or novella. And in interacting with these characters, libido or life force begins to kind of move around, because the self wants things to move into wholeness. It doesn't want us to get trapped in just one side or one tiny sliver of the story. So I'm left with feeling that we've just scratched the surface whenever we talk about the parental complexes, because it's just so huge.
We seem to have come to a place where, nevertheless, it's time to transition into a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
The dreamer is a 24-year-old male who works as a behavioral interventionist and also writes creatively. And here's the dream. I woke up in a large 3-story wooden house that was inhabited by 3 or 4 other people. One was a film director who was coaching a rather unwilling, melancholy actress. I explored the different areas of the home and came to the conclusion that this building was too old and was being deconstructed for something new. The floorboards creaked and the walls were peeling off the way tree bark does. After coming downstairs, back to the first floor, and walking down the main hallway, a knock sounded at the front door. First I looked through the peephole. A grungy-looking middle-aged man with short gray hair and a week-old beard stood impatiently waiting. I opened the door and he abrasively brushed past me. He was wearing a long, worn, dark, gingerbread-colored raincoat. At this moment, the importance of the decaying house vanished behind me, along with the strange director and actress. I was led down a short set of stairs to a jungle-sized backyard wet with snow. I stood alone now, gazing at the canopies. In the distance, something caught his eye. An animal, alone amidst the fog and snow. A black panther stood staring at me. I was afraid and buried myself in the snow as the black panther came running full speed towards me. As this situation began to fade, I woke up in a hospital where I was being shown that his hip had been injured. He shares some context for us. The dreamer had just moved in with his girlfriend, whom he had not known for a long time, but felt a deep connection with. He was finishing up a few important creative musical projects and was working at a bakery. He'd had this dream about a year ago, and its imagery had had a large impact on how he had started to change things in his life. And now he's on his way to transferring to a 4-year university. The relationship is going really well. They live together, and she's also pursuing a career path with a lot of passion. He says that the main feelings in the dream were fear, change, and awe towards the end, and it had this sci-fi fantasy tone. He mentions one more thing, that he was really fascinated by the Black Panther movement when he was about 20 and 21 years old. And he had also named one of his cats Bagheera, after the Black Panther character from the Jungle Book.
So some old structure is needing to be transformed. It's kind of lived out its life, and there's not much more libido there. We've got this old house. If we're starting off, we've got a house that is needing to be deconstructed. And then there's a film director who likewise is trying to cajole an unwilling melancholy actress. So the old way of acting is no longer lively.
Yeah, there's something about the old show
Mm-hmm.
in the psyche that's, wearing thin. And I love the image of the walls peeling off the way tree bark does, because suddenly the process of deconstruction feels so organic.
Exactly. Yes, I had a similar thought.
And so if this happens and things are somehow deconstructing themselves in a way that also implies growth, because tree bark falls off in order for the tree to expand.
Yeah, that's great.
So if this, then there's a knock at the door. Isn't this like a fairy tale? And then there was a knock at the door.
Yes.
And here's this grungy looking middle-aged man with short grayed hair and a week-old beard. It's a great description. He abrasively brushes past the dream ego, and he's wearing this long, worn, dark gingerbread colored raincoat. So the whole image is this sort of wonderful kind of grungy image.
Yeah, this is not exactly what you expect the new thing
exactly.
to show up like, right?
Yeah, right. It was not a knight in shining armor. It's a grungy middle-aged man who's also pretty just abrasive. He just brushes past. So here is a very kind of at initial outset unappealing agent of transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And the house vanishes, but he's standing there with the strange director and the actress.
No, he says the house vanishes along with the strange director and actress. So
sorry.
I think the strange director and actress vanish as well.
Okay.
This part is a little confusing. I think we're going to have to make some assumptions about what pronouns are referring to. But then he says, I was led down a short set of stairs. So I'm assuming that the middle-aged man leads him down a short set of stairs. So there's your agent of transformation. And then there's this enormous backyard wet with snow.
So clearly the male figure is an agent of change in some way. When I think about that image, I think about Columbo, that like a TV detective.
It's funny, that had occurred to me too. And wherever they got that rumpled trench coat that he wore forever, it was a miracle of the costume department.
It's also standard gear for baby boomer fathers. I mean, my dad wore a trench coat to work. It was kind of like a uniform for men of that age.
Yes.
They walked around with it all the time. Mm-hmm. In fact, you had little zippered linings for the winter, for the summer, like you didn't even need to change the coat. But it's a juxtaposition to him being 24. So at 24, I mean, we don't know this fellow, but it would be natural to have a fair bit of the Pwhere in you, because that's age appropriate, full of dreams, passion, romance, the future, launching, and even that wonderful juicy place he's in with his beloved, and they're all launching. And it's wonderful, but gestating inside of him is a kind of middle-aged guy who doesn't give a crap what he looks like, who doesn't give a crap what his, clothes look like, and he doesn't give a crap about even being polite. He's like cast off all of the stuff of being pleasing to other people, just kind of barges right in. But that kind of unaccommodating version of the masculine allows him to leave all the theatrics. That's all dissolved. And he's cast now into a relationship with something that's instinctive and unapologetic. The man, much like a panther.
And mature.
Yeah, just kind of shows up.
Right. And it is interesting because it's sort of like when the middle-aged man disappears, then there's a Black Panther, which I think is where you were going, Joseph.
Yeah. And that the guy is not unlike the panther. The way the panther is just galloping towards him, and this guy gallops into his psyche. And that is also something about the restorative masculine, that when we're young men, being pleasing is so important. I mean, I have a lot of young men in my practice, and they're doing everything they can. They're constantly asking me, like, how do I need to change so that girls will like me on Tinder? Like, what's the secret password and the language? And should I put a shirtless pic, or should I get a haircut? And there's, all of, it's like a quest, but it's all mutable. Like, how do I need to transform to be a love object, to be successful, et cetera, et cetera. And that's age appropriate, of course. But to be able to, for a man to finally transition out of that and to say, oh my God, I just could give a shit whether people like my haircut, is incredibly liberating. Maybe not that appealing to their wives, but there is something deeply freeing about letting go of being pleasing.
Yeah, this figure of the middle-aged man who, as you said, Joseph, is unaccommodating. He's unaccommodating to cultural norms about how you should dress and do your hair. And he's unaccommodating to any kind of norm of politeness of, hello, may I come in? He just brushes past. But he's a real psychopomp. He's a real guide into a kind of underworld or the backyard that is jungle-like. He says jungle-sized. But so here's a juxtaposition. We don't think of jungles wet with snow. So here's a scene in winter that isn't our usual association to a jungle, except I just wonder if there's lots and lots and lots of undergrowth and overgrowth. There's a lot of plant life and the kind of wild growth energy that we think of for jungles. Just everything's growing.
And the unexplored. Before we have this terrain, the wild, the jungles inside of ourselves that really are kind of gasping when we even just get a glimpse of it.
I'm still kind of maybe like their dream ego. I'm standing in the snow and I'm mired in it as he was. But I'm thinking about what is snow? Of what's frozen here?
It's hide, which is interesting.
Yeah, he says a backyard wet with snow, but obviously it's also cold and wet with snow. I'm wondering about the feeling function here, that just as the melancholy actress was unwilling to emote and get into the role she was supposed to play, that I'm wondering now if it's the dream ego that's also in this place of cold, frozen wetness.
Well, and I want to pick up on that and just also say that in terms of what the dream ego is doing, it's very positive that when the knock sounds on the door, he looks through the peephole and then he opens the door. A lot of dreams have, there was a knock on the door and someone was trying to get in and I barred the door or I ran away or something. But it's significant, I think, that he opens the door to this new thing. But as you're picking up, Deb, and I think you're right probably to link the snow with the melancholic actress, but he says fog and snow. And when there's fog and snow, usually the snow is in the way of melting.
Yes, fair enough. Absolutely.
There's this, I think, important thing about the deconstructing and the falling tree bark and the onset of winter, that the winter of the soul is also when the last leaves fall off the trees. So yes, it may actually be suggesting the onset of a melancholic period for himself. The life force is going to go underground, and he himself even tries to dive under the ground and hide. But also, there's something about the natural cycle of it that makes me feel less about frozen emotion and more about surrendering to a natural cycle of letting go, which, by the way, is part of the Pwhere maturation.
Mhm.
The luxuriant fantasies, of the Pwhere have to give rise to a certain kind of purgative winter so that only what's robust returns the next year, to be built, for a life to be built on.
Yes. I mean, I think that the appearance of the Black Panther is, whatever we make of the snow. Wow, this is a confrontation with some very significant numinous instinctual energy that's just there, and I think heralding some kind of change, which the dreamer at first very much wants to resist by plunging back into this winter space. He tries to bury himself in the snow, but that we can imagine that wouldn't be very effective.
There's also, if we look down in the context, he had just moved in with his girlfriend. So the panther could also have been his encounter with the instinctive feminine. And big cats are generally connected to that. And by the way, von Franz wrote a little book on the cat as an image of the feminine, which would be a great thing to read relative to this dream. So he's finally moving in with a girlfriend. This is several years ago. He's younger than 24. And part of him may very well have been kind of diving, underneath to avoid the intensity of all of that feminine dynamism. But if we take his hip to mean the old guy's hip, so even though the boy in him dives under the snow, apparently the grizzly old guy and the panther have an encounter. And the wound in the hip is similar to the wound in the Fisher King.
Yeah, this is one of the parts of the dream that I found perplexing, because I was not sure if the hip belonged to the man or to the panther.
We're not sure. I think it's just, from the wording in the dream, it's just unclear. However, I'm assuming that it was the grungy old man too, because a panther wouldn't be in a hospital. And it seems somehow unlikely to even use that kind of language somehow for the animal. So I was thinking about a hip injury, and it's parallel in my mind to the Fisher King. I'm not so familiar with, but I was thinking of Chiron and Oedipus and injuries to the leg, injuries to that place of mobility, are the standpoint. And how those wounds were also part of a growth and maturation process. That the wound was very real, and it served the purpose of becoming bigger and having to deal with pain.
I think that sounds right on, but I think often in fairy tales, you really have fairy tales being told about penises. So often a wound to the hip was meant to imply generative phenomena of men's hips. And yes, we could say that even just the ability to ambulate, to march, to work is a kind of phallic force. But the wound to the thigh in the Fisher King, I think, is generally understood to be a wound to sexual functioning, as we could imagine. So it may also be that, part of the initiation into the instinctive feminine and living with his girlfriend, is to tolerate or to revisit his own wounds to his masculine sexuality. And how will he meet the kind of fierce feminine, knowing that he may have wounds to his masculinity? And clearly, since the several years have passed, he seems to have met that successfully because life, the way he describes it, is really vibrant.
Yeah, this dream really delineates the beginning of a quest.
And he has a fascination, or had a fascination, with the Black Panther movement, which is about power and demanding, seeking, and taking power. And he named one of his mother cats a black cat, Bagheera, after the Black Panther from the Jungle Book. And then my third thought here is, and it may be sort of overdetermined, but the word panther is made up of pant and her, of wearing the pants and a her. So that's a real reach, I know. However, we are talking about a new accommodation with power and with the feminine as he moves into a rewarding relationship with a girlfriend.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this seems to have resolved nicely. The last thing I want to offer about the grungy middle-aged man, it's an image that came to mind. If you remember Lord of the Rings, there's these really elegant wizards. There's Gandalf and Saruman, and then there's Radagast the Brown, who's like this kind of disheveled guy that has a bird's nest in his hat and the bird craps coming down the side of his hair, who actually, like the Dumbling in the fairy tales, is a pivotal figure in terms of negotiating with the instinctive. It's the disheveled wizard with feathers and bird's nest in his head that's able to interact with the panthers of the world and do what's necessary or play an incredible part in the heroic journey.
Yeah, that's nice.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.